The candles had barely settled into their holders when the doors of Ashworth Hall burst open and the entire ballroom dropped into silence. Duke Sebastian Ashworth stood at the top of the marble staircase, his dark coat sharp against the gold light, his eyes sweeping across the crowd like a blade looking for something to cut. Every guest bent their head. Every servant froze mid-step. Every candle seemed to hold its breath. Except one woman. Elena Voss stood near the long table of white roses, clipboard in hand, checking the seating arrangement for the night's charity gala. She did not look up right away, and when she finally did, she did not bow. She simply met his eyes the way one person looks at another, not the way a subject looks at a ruler. Sebastian noticed instantly. He always noticed disobedience, the way a hawk notices movement in tall grass. He came down the stairs slowly, each step measured, each step designed to make the room feel smaller. "You," he said, stopping in front of her, "Beau." The word landed heavy in the silence. Nearby guests turned their heads, pretending to admire the flowers while straining to hear every syllable. Elena lowered her clipboard but not her gaze. "I was hired to organize this evening, Your Grace, not to kneel for it." A ripple of shock passed through the crowd, soft gasps hidden behind gloved hands. No one spoke to the Duke that way. No one had, not in the 12 years since he inherited the title, not since his father died and left him a house full of servants who flinched at the sound of his footsteps. "You dare correct me in my own home." His voice was low, but it carried, the way thunder carries even when it is still far away. "I am not correcting you," Elena said. "I am simply doing my job. Bowing is not part of the contract I signed." Sebastian's jaw tightened. He was not used to being refused. He was used to silence, agreement, and the careful, practiced obedience of people who feared what would happen if they did otherwise. This woman, in her plain gray dress with her dark hair pinned neatly back, showed no fear at all. If anything, there was a flicker of amusement behind her eyes, as though she found his anger mildly entertaining rather than terrifying. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice dropping further, quieter now, which somehow made it more dangerous. "I know exactly who you are," Elena replied. "You are the man who is currently making his own charity gala very uncomfortable for 200 guests who came here to raise money for children's hospitals, not to watch you demand that a party planner kneel on a marble floor." For a moment, nobody breathed. Somewhere near the string quartet, a violin bow slipped from a musician's trembling fingers and clattered softly against the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Sebastian felt something strange stir inside his chest, something he could not name right away. It was not only anger. There was a thread of something else woven through it, something closer to curiosity, though he refused to acknowledge it in that moment. "Leave," he said instead. "You are dismissed from this event, and from any future work with this house." Elena did not flinch. She set her clipboard down calmly on the table beside the roses. "As you wish, Your Grace. Though I imagine the guests you invited to support struggling families might find it interesting that you spent the opening minutes of a charity gala trying to force a working woman to her knees instead of welcoming them." The words hit harder than he expected. He saw a few guests exchange uneasy glances. A journalist near the back, notebook tucked half out of sight in her clutch bag, was watching the exchange with obvious, sharpening interest. Before Sebastian could respond, a new voice cut through the tension, calm and commanding in its own quiet way. "Sebastian." He turned. His grandmother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret Ashworth, stood at the base of the staircase, leaning lightly on her cane, her silver hair pinned into its usual immaculate coil. She had a way of appearing at exactly the moment a room needed steadying, as though she carried her own quiet authority that did not need raised voices to be felt. "Grandmother," he said, straightening, "this does not concern you." "It concerns me the moment you threatened to dismiss the only person capable of saving this event from disaster," Margaret said, walking toward them with unhurried steps. "Miss Voss was hired directly by me. She is the reason the hospital wing renovation fund has any chance of reaching its target tonight. You will not be firing her, Sebastian." "Not unless you would like to explain to the board. Why the gala collapsed an hour before it began. Sebastian's eyes flicked between his grandmother and Alina, something tightening behind his composed expression. He hated being cornered, and he hated even more that it was happening in front of an audience. "Fine," he said finally, his voice clipped. "She stays for tonight." "For as long as I decide she is needed," Margaret corrected gently, though there was steel beneath the softness. "Now both of you smile. There are cameras by the entrance, and this family has enough scandal to manage without adding tonight to the list." She turned and moved toward the crowd, greeting guests with practiced warmth, leaving Sebastian and Alina standing in the wreckage of the moment they had created. Alina picked her clipboard back up, her hands steady despite the storm that had just passed. "I still have work to do," she said simply, and walked past him toward the kitchen staff waiting near the far doors, her heels clicking against the marble in a rhythm that felt, to Sebastian's irritation, entirely unbothered. He stood there a moment longer, watching her go, a strange heat still lingering in his chest. No one spoke to him like that. No one ever had. His father had built this house on fear, on the idea that respect could be manufactured through intimidation, and Sebastian had inherited that belief along with the title, the land, and the endless expectations that came with both. Yet here was a woman who looked at him and saw nothing to fear at all. The gala continued around him, guests slowly returning to their conversations, the string quartet resuming their music, waitstaff moving again with trays of champagne. But Sebastian found his eyes drifting again and again toward the woman in the gray dress, directing florists, adjusting table settings, calming a nervous young server who had nearly dropped a tray near the dessert table. She moved through the chaos like someone who had faced far worse, and refused to be shaken by any of it. Lady Cordelia Whitmore appeared at his side some time later, her gloved hand resting lightly on his arm, her smile practiced and bright. "That was quite a scene," she said, her voice sweet but sharp underneath, like sugar poured over something bitter. "Imagine a hired planner speaking to you like that." "It was nothing," Sebastian said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Of course," Cordelia said, though her eyes tracked toward Alina across the room with a look that was anything but dismissive. "Still, one wonders where she learned such confidence. Servants usually know their place." "She is not a servant," Sebastian said, more sharply than he intended. "She is an event coordinator contracted for the evening." Cordelia's smile thinned slightly at his correction, but she said nothing further, choosing instead to steer the conversation toward safer topics, toward the charity totals and the guest list, and the newest scandal circulating among the aristocracy. But Sebastian barely heard her. His attention kept drifting back across the room, to the woman who had refused to bow, who had spoken to him as though he were simply a man and not a title, who had, for the first time in longer than he could remember, made him feel something other than the tired weight of duty. By the time the gala reached its final hour, the hospital fund had exceeded its goal, largely due to a heartfelt, unplanned speech Alina had convinced one of the guests to give. A speech that moved half the room to tears and loosened wallets that had stayed closed all evening. Sebastian watched from the edge of the room as she orchestrated the final moments of the event with quiet precision, never once seeking his approval, never once glancing his way for validation. It irritated him more than he wanted to admit. As the last guests filtered out and the staff began clearing tables, Sebastian found himself walking toward her, though he could not entirely explain why. "The gala was a success," he said, stopping a few feet away. "I know," Alina replied, not looking up from the notes she was finishing. "I planned it that way." "Despite the interruption," he added, an odd note of something like an apology hidden beneath the words. Alina finally looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Despite it, Your Grace, not because of it." He opened his mouth to respond, but found he had nothing sharp enough to say. For the first time in years, he was at a loss for words in his own home, standing in front of a woman half his height in influence but somehow twice his equal in composure. "I trust you'll return tomorrow to finish the closing arrangements," he said instead, retreating to formality because it was the only shield he had left. "I will," Alina said, "though I'd appreciate it if next time, Your Grace, you greeted your guests instead of interrogating your staff." She gathered her things and walked toward the door, leaving him standing alone amid the fading candlelight and the scent of white roses, the echo of her words settling over him like something he could not quite shake off. He did not understand it yet, not fully, but something in that ballroom had shifted the moment she refused to bow. A door had opened somewhere inside him that he had spent years keeping locked, and though he told himself it meant nothing, though he told himself she was simply a stubborn woman who did not know her place, a small and persistent part of him already knew that the coming days would not be as ordinary as he wanted them to be. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet, and Alina walked to her car without looking back, unaware that behind the tall windows of Ashworth Hall, the Duke stood watching her leave, already wondering against his own will when he would see her again. Morning arrived at Ashworth Hall with a heavy gray sky, the kind that threatened rain without ever committing to it. Sebastian sat in his study, staring at a folder full of unfinished paperwork, though his mind kept drifting back to the ballroom, to the sound of a woman's voice refusing to bend. He told himself it was irritation. He told himself it was the sting of being challenged in front of 200 guests, in front of cameras, in front of a grandmother who never let him forget his mistakes. He told himself many things that morning, none of which quieted the strange restlessness sitting beneath his ribs. A knock interrupted his thoughts. His butler, Edmund, stepped inside, his expression carefully neutral in the way only a man who had served this family for 30 years could manage. "Miss Voss has arrived, Your Grace. She is in the East Hall, finishing the closing arrangements from last night." Sebastian set down his pen. "Did she ask for me?" "No, Your Grace, she asked for nothing at all." There was something in Edmund's tone, a flicker of amusement quickly hidden, that made Sebastian narrow his eyes. "You find something entertaining about this, Edmund?" "Not at all, Your Grace," Edmund said, though the corner of his mouth twitched. "It is simply unusual to meet someone who does not ask for anything from this house." Sebastian dismissed him with a wave, though the comment lingered longer than he liked. He rose from his desk, telling himself he was merely going to inspect the hall for lingering damage from the event, nothing more. When he arrived, Alina was standing on a small ladder, removing the last of the floral arrangements from the high shelves near the windows. She wore simple clothes today, far removed from the formal gray dress of the night before, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hair loosely tied back. "You're still here," Sebastian said, announcing his presence. Alina glanced down at him, unbothered. "The contract includes cleanup. I don't leave jobs half-finished, Your Grace, even when the client is difficult." "I am not difficult," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he heard how hollow they sounded. "You ordered a stranger to bow to you in front of 200 people," Alina said, stepping down from the ladder with the last vase in hand. "I believe that qualifies as difficult by most definitions." Sebastian crossed his arms. "You have quite the tongue for someone in your position." "And you have quite the temper for someone in yours," she replied, setting the vase down and brushing her hands against her skirt. For a moment neither spoke. The silence between them was not entirely uncomfortable, though Sebastian could not explain why. It felt strangely like the calm after an argument that had already run its course, leaving behind something clearer than before. "My grandmother tells me you were hired for your skill, not your obedience," he said finally, choosing his words carefully. "Obedience was never part of the job description," Alina said. "Results were. I imagine the hospital fund exceeding its goal by nearly £40,000 speaks for itself." Sebastian's brow lifted slightly. He had not yet reviewed the final numbers, though he suspected she was telling the truth. Everything about her suggested competence layered over confidence, a combination he found simultaneously admirable and deeply frustrating. "I want you to oversee the remaining events this season," he said abruptly, surprising even himself with the decision. Elena paused, studying him carefully, as though trying to determine whether this was a trap or a genuine offer. Under what conditions? None beyond the usual contract, he said. Though I will be present at each event, ensuring things run according to standard. You mean you'll be watching me, she said flatly. I mean I'll be overseeing my own household's affairs, he replied, though the correction felt weaker than he intended it to sound. Elena studied him a moment longer before nodding. Fine, but if you plan to interrupt my work the way you did last night, I will not hesitate to remind you, publicly if necessary, that respect is earned, not demanded. Duly noted, Sebastian said, an unfamiliar warmth creeping into his voice that he quickly masked with formality. I'll have Edmund send over the schedule for the coming weeks. As she gathered her tools and prepared to leave, Sebastian found himself lingering near the doorway, watching her movements with an attention he could not fully justify to himself. Miss Voss, he said before she reached the exit. She paused, turning slightly. Yes, Your Grace. Last night, he began, the words feeling unfamiliar in his mouth. The speech, the one that pushed the donations past the target. That was your doing, wasn't it? It was, she said simply. Why would you go to such lengths for a cause that has nothing to do with your contract? Elena considered the question for a moment, her expression softening slightly, the sharp edges of their earlier exchange fading into something more thoughtful. Because children in that hospital wing don't care whether the money came from a perfect event or a chaotic one. They only care whether the roof gets fixed and the equipment gets funded. Everything else is just noise. Sebastian said nothing, but something in her answer settled into him differently than anything else she had said. It was not defiance this time, nor sharpness. It was simply honesty, unpolished and unguarded, the kind of statement that revealed more about a person than any grand speech ever could. I see, he said finally, though the words felt inadequate for what he actually felt. Elena gave him a small nod and left, the sound of her footsteps fading down the long hallway, leaving Sebastian alone with a silence that felt heavier than before, though not unpleasant. Word of the previous night's confrontation spread quickly through the social circles that mattered most to the Ashworth name. By afternoon, whispers had already reached the ears of Lady Cordelia Whitmore, who arrived at the estate unannounced, her expression a careful blend of concern and curiosity. "Darling, is it true," she asked, finding Sebastian in the study, "that you nearly dismissed the planner in front of everyone and your grandmother had to intervene?" "News travels fast," Sebastian said dryly, not looking up from his papers. "It is the talk of every drawing room in the city," Cordelia said, settling into the chair across from his desk without invitation. "People are saying she humiliated you." "No one humiliated me," Sebastian said, his voice sharper than he intended. "Of course not," Cordelia said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Still, it seems unwise to keep someone employed who speaks to you with such disrespect. Perhaps it would be best to let her go quietly before the story grows any larger." Sebastian finally looked up, studying Cordelia carefully. There was something calculating behind her concern, something that made him wary, though he could not yet name it. "Miss Voss will remain employed for as long as her skills are needed," he said firmly. "The matter is closed." Cordelia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly before smoothing back into its usual polish. "As you wish. I only worry about your reputation, Sebastian. People talk." "People always talk," he said. "It has never once changed my decisions before, and it will not start now." She left shortly after, though the visit lingered in his mind longer than he wanted to admit. There was something about the way she spoke of Elena, something laced with more than simple concern, that made him uneasy in a way he could not fully articulate. That evening, as the household settled into quiet, Sebastian found himself walking the gardens alone, the cool air doing little to calm the restless thoughts circling in his mind. He thought of his father, of the countless lessons drilled into him since childhood, the idea that authority meant control, that respect meant fear, that weakness could never be shown, not to servants, not to peers, not even to family. He thought of the ballroom, of Alina's steady voice refusing to bend beneath the weight of his title. And for the first time in years, he wondered whether everything he had been taught about power was built on a foundation far weaker than he had ever allowed himself to see. The following days brought a strange rhythm to the estate. Alina arrived each morning to plan the upcoming autumn benefit, moving through the halls with quiet efficiency, never seeking Sebastian's approval, never softening her opinions simply because he held a title above her. And though he told himself repeatedly that her presence was purely professional, he found himself finding reasons to walk past the rooms where she worked, to ask unnecessary questions about the guest list, to linger a little longer than necessary whenever their conversations drifted beyond the boundaries of business. It was during one such conversation, as she reviewed floor plans spread across the long table in the East Hall, that she finally addressed the shift directly. "You've been finding excuses to check on my work every day this week," she said, not looking up from the papers. Sebastian felt a flicker of something close to embarrassment, quickly buried beneath practiced composure. "I am simply ensuring things proceed according to standard." "Your standards seem to require checking on me at least 4 times a day," Alina said, glancing up with the faintest hint of amusement in her eyes. "That seems excessive for someone who claims indifference." "I never claimed indifference," Sebastian said before he could stop himself. Alina's brow lifted slightly, though she said nothing further, returning her attention to the floor plans as though the moment had not shifted something unspoken between them. Sebastian stood there a moment longer, aware that he had revealed more than he intended, aware that something in his carefully constructed walls had begun, slowly and against his will, to crack. He left the room without another word, though the exchange followed him long after he had gone, settling into his thoughts with a persistence he could neither explain nor entirely resist. The autumn benefit was 3 weeks away, and the estate had transformed into a hive of careful preparation. Alina spent her mornings coordinating with florists and caterers, her afternoons reviewing seating charts with the precision of someone who understood that even small details could determine whether an evening succeeded or collapsed into chaos. Sebastian, despite his early insistence that he would only oversee the arrangements from a distance, found himself drawn into the process far more than he had planned. It began with small things, a question about which wine pairings suited the autumn menu, a disagreement about whether the orchestra should play before or after the opening remarks, a debate over whether the charity's founder should speak first or last, a debate that stretched into nearly an hour before either of them conceded any ground. "You argue about everything," Alina said one afternoon, exasperated as they stood in the ballroom reviewing table arrangements for the 3rd time that week. "I argue about things that matter," Sebastian replied. "The order of speakers affects the emotional arc of the evening. If the founder speaks last, the donations spike. If she speaks first, people forget the details by the time the auction begins." Alina stared at him, clearly caught off guard. "That is actually a fair point." "I do have them occasionally," Sebastian said, a rare hint of dry humor slipping into his voice. Alina laughed, a short, surprised sound that seemed to catch her as much as it caught him. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and something about it settled into his chest with unexpected warmth, a feeling he quickly tried to dismiss as simple satisfaction over winning an argument. Their days fell into an unspoken pattern after that. Sebastian would find reasons to appear wherever Alina was working, and she, though she never openly admitted it, seemed to expect his presence more than she once did. Their conversations grew longer, drifting beyond seating charts and menu selections into subjects neither of them had planned to share. One afternoon, as rain tapped steadily against the tall windows of the library, Alina found Sebastian standing near the fireplace, staring into the flames with an expression she had not seen from him before, something distant and unguarded. "You look like a man carrying the weight of the entire estate on his shoulders," she said, stepping inside. Sebastian glanced up, momentarily surprised by her presence. "It sometimes feels that way." Care to share the source of tonight's brooding, or is that classified information reserved only for dukes? She asked, settling into one of the armchairs near the fire. He hesitated, unused to being asked such direct questions, especially by someone outside his family. But something about the quiet library, the soft crackle of the fire, and the steady patience in her expression made the words come easier than he expected. "My father built this house on control," he said finally. "He believed weakness invited disaster, that any softness would be seen as an opportunity for others to take advantage. He raised me the same way, discipline before affection, authority before understanding." Alina listened without interrupting, her expression neither pitying nor dismissive, simply present. "When he passed, I inherited everything," Sebastian continued. "The title, the estate, the expectations. I have spent every day since trying to prove I am capable of holding it all together, the way he did, the way everyone expects a duke to." "And bowing," Alina said quietly, "became part of proving that." Sebastian looked at her, startled by how easily she had connected the pieces he had never spoken aloud to anyone. "I suppose it did," he admitted, "though I never considered it that clearly until now." "You don't have to prove anything by demanding people fear you," Alina said. "Respect built on fear collapses the moment someone finally stops being afraid." "Is that what happened the night we met?" he asked, a faint, almost involuntary smile touching his lips. "You simply stopped being afraid." "I was never afraid," Alina said simply. "I have worked for far more difficult people than you, Your Grace." Sebastian raised an eyebrow. "Difficult how?" "My last employer once made an entire kitchen staff cry because the wrong shade of white was used for the tablecloths," Alina said. "You, by comparison, are relatively tame." Sebastian laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that surprised even him. It had been years since laughter had come so easily, without calculation, without the careful consideration of how it might be perceived by others. "You have a talent for making impossible situations feel manageable," he said, the warmth in his voice unmistakable now. "It comes with the job," Alina replied, though her cheeks had colored slightly at his words, a small crack in her usual composure. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence with a comfort neither expected to find in each other's company. For the first time since his father's passing, Sebastian felt something loosen inside him, some old, tightly wound thread beginning slowly to relax. Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed by the household staff, who exchanged quiet, knowing glances whenever the Duke lingered longer than necessary near the East Hall, or whenever Alina's laughter echoed unexpectedly through the usually solemn corridors of Ashworth Hall. Even Margaret, the Dowager Duchess, began watching the pair with a careful, thoughtful expression during their brief encounters at breakfast or in passing through the halls. "You seem different lately," Margaret observed one morning, as Sebastian reviewed correspondence at the long dining table. "Different how?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Lighter," Margaret said simply. "Less like your father, and more like the boy you were before he decided sternness was the only acceptable virtue." Sebastian said nothing, though the comment settled uncomfortably close to a truth he had not yet allowed himself to fully examine. "Miss Voss has been good for this house," Margaret continued, watching him carefully, "and I suspect good for you as well." "She is simply skilled at her job," Sebastian said, retreating into familiar deflection. Margaret's expression softened with a knowing patience that only came from decades of watching people avoid their own feelings. "Sebastian, I have known you your entire life. I have watched you build walls so high that even I struggle to reach you some days. But I have not seen you laugh, truly laugh, since before your father passed, until these past few weeks." Sebastian set down his cup, unsure how to respond to an observation that struck closer to the truth than he was ready to admit. "Be careful," Margaret added gently, "not to let old fears convince you that happiness is something dangerous simply because it feels unfamiliar." She left him with those words lingering in the quiet dining room, words that followed him throughout the day, resurfacing each time he found himself seeking out Alina's presence under increasingly thin professional excuses. Later that week, during a walk through the estate's expansive gardens, meant originally as a discussion about outdoor lighting for the benefit, Sebastian and Alina found themselves drifting into conversation that had little to do with the event at all. "Do you ever wish for a life away from all of this?" Alina asked, gesturing toward the grand house behind them. The title, the expectations, the constant performance of authority. Sebastian considered the question carefully before answering. "Sometimes, though I am not certain what such a life would even look like. This house has been the only version of myself I have ever known." "That sounds lonely," Alina said softly. "It is," Sebastian admitted, the honesty surprising him even as he spoke it. "Though I have grown accustomed to it, loneliness becomes easier to bear once you stop expecting anything different." Alina stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "You shouldn't have to grow accustomed to loneliness, Sebastian. No one should." It was the first time she had used his given name instead of his title, and the sound of it, spoken so plainly, so without hesitation, struck him with unexpected force. "Say that again," he said quietly. "What your name?" Alina asked, a small teasing smile playing at her lips. "Yes," he said. "I find I quite like the way it sounds without the title attached to it." "Sebastian," she repeated softly, and something in the simple sound of it, spoken without deference, without fear, settled deep into his chest like a key finally fitting into a lock he had long forgotten existed. They stood there a moment longer, the garden quiet around them, the late afternoon sun casting long golden shadows across the gravel path. Neither spoke, though the silence between them had shifted into something entirely different from the tension of their first meeting, something warmer, something that neither of them was quite ready to name aloud. "We should return," Alina said finally, breaking the moment. "The lighting vendor is expecting us in 20 minutes. "Of course," Sebastian said, though a part of him wished, quietly and against every lesson his father had ever taught him, that the moment could have lasted a little longer. As they walked back toward the house, Sebastian found himself reflecting on how quickly everything had shifted since the night of the gala, since the moment a stranger had refused to bow, and had instead looked him directly in the eye, unafraid, unimpressed by his title, entirely herself. He had spent his life believing that strength meant control, that respect required distance, that vulnerability was a weakness to be hidden at all costs. Yet here he was, walking beside a woman who had shattered every one of those beliefs simply by refusing to bend. And for the first time, he found himself wondering whether perhaps his father had been wrong about everything that truly mattered. That evening, as the household quieted and the last candles were extinguished throughout the halls, Sebastian stood at his bedroom window, looking out over the darkened gardens where, only hours earlier, everything had felt different, lighter, more possible than it had in years. He did not yet understand the full weight of what was beginning to grow inside him, nor did he suspect how quickly it would be tested by forces neither he nor Alina could yet see approaching. But standing there in the quiet dark, he allowed himself, just for a moment, to feel something he had long denied himself. Hope. The days leading up to the autumn benefit passed in a blur of fittings, deliveries, and last-minute changes. Yet within that blur, something steady had taken root between Sebastian and Alina, something neither of them spoke of directly, but both seemed to recognize in the way their conversations lingered longer than necessary, in the way silences between them no longer felt uncomfortable but familiar. One evening, after the household staff had retired and the halls had fallen quiet, Sebastian found Alina still working in the East Hall, surrounded by scattered papers and half-finished seating charts, her focus so complete that she did not notice him standing in the doorway until he spoke. "You should have gone home hours ago," he said gently. Alina startled slightly, then relaxed when she saw him. "There's too much left to finish. The benefit is in 4 days, and half the vendors still haven't confirmed their delivery times." "Let me help," Sebastian offered, stepping into the room. Alina raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. You want to confirm delivery times for floral arrangements. I want to make sure you don't collapse from exhaustion before the event even begins, he said, pulling a chair beside her and reaching for one of the vendor lists. They worked together for nearly 2 hours, dividing tasks, making calls, adjusting timelines, and somewhere within that quiet, focused collaboration, Sebastian found himself watching Alina more than he was watching the paperwork in front of him. There was something captivating about the way she worked, the sharp focus in her eyes, the small furrow of concentration between her brows, the way she chewed the end of her pen whenever a particular problem proved difficult to solve. "You're staring," Alina said without looking up, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I am simply supervising," Sebastian replied, though the heat rising to his face betrayed him slightly. Alina finally looked up, meeting his eyes directly, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The papers between them, the vendor lists, the seating charts, all of it faded into the background of a silence that felt charged with something neither of them had yet acknowledged aloud. "Sebastian," Alina said softly, breaking the quiet, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Why did you never marry?" she asked. "Surely a duke of your standing has had no shortage of offers." Sebastian leaned back slightly, considering the question carefully. "Offers, yes. Genuine connection, far less so. Most women who have shown interest were far more interested in the title than the man attached to it." "And you could tell the difference?" Alina asked. "Eventually," Sebastian said, "though it took years to stop mistaking flattery for affection." Alina studied him quietly, something soft and understanding in her expression. "That sounds exhausting." "It was," he admitted, "though I have found recently that genuine connection is far easier to recognize once you have experienced it." The words hung between them, heavier than either of them expected, and Alina's breath caught slightly at the implication behind them. She did not look away, nor did he, and for a long, suspended moment the space between them seemed to shrink without either of them moving at all. "Sebastian," Alina began, though whatever she intended to say was interrupted by the sudden ringing of her phone, shattering the moment entirely. She answered quickly, her professional tone snapping back into place as she dealt with a last-minute vendor concern, and Sebastian sat back, the interrupted moment leaving a strange ache in his chest that he did not fully understand. When she finished the call, the earlier tension had softened into something more manageable, though neither of them mentioned what had almost been said. "I should head home," Alina said, gathering her things. "Early morning tomorrow." "Let me walk you to your car," Sebastian offered. They walked together through the quiet halls of Ashworth Hall, the only sound the soft echo of their footsteps against the marble floors. Outside, the night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves and distant rain. "Thank you for staying to help tonight," Alina said as they reached her car. "It was no trouble," Sebastian said. "I find I rather enjoy your company, even when it involves confirming delivery schedules for floral arrangements." Alina laughed softly, high praise coming from a duke. "Only the highest," he replied, a genuine warmth in his voice that surprised them both. For a moment neither moved, the space between them charged with something unspoken, something that had been building slowly since the night of the gala, growing steadily with each shared conversation, each unexpected laugh, each quiet moment of understanding neither of them had planned to find in the other. "Good night, Sebastian," Alina said finally, breaking the moment gently. "Good night, Alina," he replied, watching as she got into her car and drove away, the taillights fading into the darkness of the long estate driveway. He stood there a while longer, the cool night air settling around him, his thoughts lingering on everything that had almost been said, everything that remained unspoken between them. And for the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to the following morning with an eagerness he could not quite explain. The next few days passed with the same quiet intimacy, small moments accumulating between them like stones building a bridge neither of them had intended to construct, but neither wanted to stop building either. A shared laugh over a caterer's mistaken delivery of pumpkin instead of pear tarts. A quiet conversation about Alina's childhood, growing up in a small town far removed from the grandeur of Ashworth Hall, learning early that hard work mattered more than inherited privilege. A moment where Sebastian, without thinking, reached out to brush a stray leaf from her hair, his hand lingering a beat longer than necessary before he withdrew it, the air between them charged with something neither had yet named. Margaret, watching from a distance during these small exchanges, allowed herself a private, knowing smile, though she said nothing, choosing instead to let the two of them find their own way toward whatever was quietly blooming between them. But not everyone watched with such warmth. Lady Cordelia Whitmore, attending a private tea with Margaret one afternoon under the guise of catching up on old friendships, found her attention repeatedly drawn to the sound of laughter drifting from the East Hall, where Sebastian and Alina were reviewing final details for the benefit. "They seem quite close," Cordelia observed, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "They work well together," Margaret replied carefully, sensing the undertone beneath Cordelia's casual observation. "One might almost mistake it for something more than professional," Cordelia continued, stirring her tea slowly. "One might," Margaret said simply, offering nothing further. Cordelia's smile remained fixed, though something colder settled behind her eyes as she watched Sebastian appear briefly in the hallway, his expression more relaxed, more genuinely happy than she had seen in years, an expression she had never once managed to draw from him despite years of careful pursuit. That evening, as the household quieted once more, Cordelia sat alone in her townhouse, turning over the afternoon's observations with growing unease. She had spent years positioning herself as the obvious choice for Sebastian's eventual marriage, cultivating connections, attending every event, ensuring her presence remained constant within his social circle. She had not anticipated a hired event planner disrupting years of careful strategy so easily, so effortlessly, without even seeming to try. The thought settled into something sharper as the night wore on, a quiet resolve forming behind her carefully composed exterior. She would not simply stand aside and watch everything she had worked toward slip away because of a woman who did not even belong to their world. Whatever it took, she decided, she would find a way to remind Sebastian exactly where loyalty and suitability truly belonged, even if it meant ensuring Alina Voss did not remain welcome at Ashworth Hall much longer. Unaware of the storm quietly gathering against her, Alina spent that same evening finalizing the last details for the benefit, humming softly to herself as she worked, her thoughts drifting more often than she wanted to admit toward a certain duke whose walls, she was beginning to realize, were not nearly as impenetrable as they first appeared. Neither of them yet understood how quickly the fragile, growing warmth between them would soon be tested by forces neither had anticipated. Forces already moving quietly in the shadows of drawing rooms and private teas, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The night of the autumn benefit arrived with a clear sky and a chill that hinted at the coming winter. Ashworth Hall glowed with warm light, every window illuminated, every corner of the estate transformed into a scene of quiet elegance. Guests arrived in a steady stream, their voices blending into a pleasant hum beneath the soft strains of the orchestra Alina had spent weeks arranging. The evening unfolded with remarkable smoothness, a testament to the countless hours Alina had poured into every detail. Sebastian found himself circulating among guests with an ease he had not felt in years, occasionally catching Alina's eye across the room, sharing small, private smiles that spoke of everything unspoken between them. It was during the final hour of the event, as the auction concluded and guests began preparing to depart, that Cordelia made her move. She approached a small circle of women near the refreshment table, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to nearby ears without appearing intentional. "It really is remarkable how quickly Miss Voss has embedded herself into the Ashworth household," she said, her tone laced with false admiration. "First the events, now apparently private dinners and long evenings alone with the Duke. One does wonder about her intentions." The women exchanged uncertain glances, clearly uncomfortable but too curious to walk away. I heard she comes from rather modest means, Cordelia continued, sipping her champagne delicately. It would explain quite a lot, wouldn't it? A struggling planner, suddenly finding herself alone with one of the wealthiest men in the country, night after night. Surely you're not suggesting, one of the women began. I'm suggesting nothing, Cordelia said smoothly. I'm simply observing what everyone else has already noticed. Sebastian has always been generous, sometimes to a fault, especially with those clever enough to make themselves indispensable. The comment spread through the remaining guests like smoke through still air, quiet and impossible to fully contain once released. By the time the last guests departed, whispers had already begun circulating, twisted slightly with each retelling, growing sharper and more suggestive with every passing conversation. Sebastian remained unaware of the rumor's origin that night, though he noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere among some of the departing guests, a coolness in certain exchanges he could not immediately explain. He dismissed it as exhaustion from the long evening, unaware of the storm quietly building beneath the surface of polite smiles and careful farewells. The following morning, however, the rumor had grown teeth. Sebastian's assistant, a nervous young man named Oliver, approached him in the study with visible discomfort. "Your Grace, I feel obligated to inform you that certain rumors have begun circulating regarding your relationship with Miss Voss." "What sort of rumors?" Sebastian asked, setting down his coffee. Oliver hesitated. "Suggestions that Miss Voss has been manipulating her position for personal gain, that her closeness with you is calculated rather than genuine." Sebastian's expression darkened immediately. "Who is spreading such nonsense?" "It's difficult to trace the origin, Your Grace, though it seems to have begun circulating shortly after last night's benefit." Sebastian dismissed Oliver curtly, his mind racing through the implications of what he had just heard. He told himself the rumor was baseless, that anyone who truly knew Alina would recognize the accusation as absurd. Yet a small, uncomfortable seed of doubt had already been planted, watered further by years of learned caution around anyone who showed interest in him, a caution his father had drilled into him since childhood. He spent the day distracted, unable to focus on estate matters, his thoughts circling back repeatedly to the rumor and its implications. By evening, when Alina arrived to finalize the benefits' financial reports, Sebastian's earlier warmth had cooled into something guarded and uncertain. "You seem tense," Alina observed, noticing the shift in his demeanor immediately. "I've heard some concerning things today," Sebastian said carefully, watching her reaction closely. "About what?" Alina asked, confusion evident in her expression. "About the nature of our arrangement," Sebastian said, choosing his words deliberately. "Suggestions that your closeness with me has been calculated rather than genuine." Alina's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then quickly to hurt. "You believe that?" "I don't know what to believe," Sebastian admitted, though the words felt like betrayal even as he spoke them. "I have been deceived before, Alina. People have sought closeness with me for reasons that had nothing to do with genuine affection. And you think I am one of them?" Alina's voice trembled slightly, though whether from hurt or anger, Sebastian could not immediately tell. "I don't know what to think," he repeated, though the coldness in his tone suggested otherwise. Alina stared at him for a long moment, something breaking visibly behind her eyes. "After everything, after every conversation, every moment we have shared these past weeks, you would believe rumors from people who have never once spoken a genuine word to me, over your own judgment." Sebastian said nothing, caught between the doubt his father's lessons had carved into him, and the growing certainty in his heart that the woman standing before him deserved far more trust than he was currently offering. "I see," Alina said finally, her voice hardening into something distant and controlled. "Then perhaps it's best I finish my contract from a professional distance going forward." "Alina," Sebastian began, but she was already gathering her belongings, her movements sharp and deliberate. "No," she said, cutting him off. I have spent my entire career building a reputation on integrity, Sebastian. I have worked twice as hard as anyone with inherited privilege simply to be taken seriously, and I will not stand here and be accused of manipulation by a man who claims to know me, simply because a room full of strangers whispered something convenient. That's not fair, Sebastian said, though even as he spoke, he recognized the weakness in his own defense. Fair? Alina's voice rose slightly, the first real crack in her composure since they had met. None of this has ever been about fairness for people like me, Your Grace. It has always been about proving worth that people like you are simply born into. I refused to bow to you the night we met not out of arrogance, but because I have spent my entire life being told to lower my head for people who assumed I owed them deference simply because of their birth. I thought, foolishly, that you were different. She walked toward the door, pausing only briefly at the threshold. I will complete the remaining administrative work by mail. There is no need for further in-person meetings. Alina, wait, Sebastian said, taking a step forward. But she was already gone, the sound of her footsteps fading quickly down the hall, leaving him standing alone in the study with the weight of his own doubt settling heavily around him. He remained there for a long while after she left, the silence of the room pressing in around him, the echo of her words repeating relentlessly in his mind. He thought of his father, of the countless warnings about trust and vulnerability, warnings that had shaped every decision he had made since childhood. He thought of the countless people who had, indeed, sought his company for reasons that had nothing to do with genuine affection. But he also thought of Alina's laughter in the library, of her honesty about her father's lessons in the garden, of the quiet, unguarded moments they had shared over the past several weeks, moments that had felt more real, more genuine, than anything he had experienced in years. Doubt, he realized slowly, was not the same as truth, no matter how deeply it had been ingrained into him since childhood. Margaret found him still sitting in the study late that evening, his expression heavy with something she recognized immediately as regret. You look like a man who has made a mistake he already knows he cannot easily undo, she observed, settling into the chair across from him. I accused her of manipulation, Sebastian admitted quietly, based on rumors I never bothered to verify. Margaret's expression softened, though there was disappointment evident beneath her gentle tone. Sebastian, your father spent years teaching you to doubt everyone's intentions, to see manipulation in every kindness, calculation in every genuine gesture. It has protected you in some ways, but it has also cost you far more than you realize. I know, Sebastian said, his voice thick with regret. I saw the hurt in her eyes, grandmother. I saw exactly what my doubt did to her, and I still could not stop myself in the moment. Old fears do not disappear simply because we wish them to, Margaret said gently. But they can be unlearned slowly, with effort, and with the right reasons to try. I need to find the source of this rumor, Sebastian said, resolve hardening in his voice. I need to prove to her, and to myself, that I am capable of trusting my own judgment over the whispers of people who have never once shown genuine care for anyone but themselves. Then I suggest you start immediately, Margaret said, before the distance between you grows too wide to cross. Sebastian rose from his chair, a new determination settling over him, the earlier doubt replaced by something far more certain. He would find the source of the rumor, and he would make things right, whatever it took, because the thought of losing Alina over something as hollow as unverified gossip felt, suddenly and undeniably, like the greatest mistake he could possibly make. Outside, the night had grown cold and quiet, the estate grounds settling into darkness beneath a sky scattered with distant stars, unaware of the quiet storm of regret and resolve building steadily within the walls of Ashworth Hall. Sebastian began his search for the truth early the next morning, starting with Oliver, who reluctantly admitted that the rumor seemed to have first surfaced among a small group of women who had been standing near the refreshment table during the final hour of the benefit. Who was near that table? Sebastian asked, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. Oliver consulted his notes carefully. Several guests, Your Grace, though Lady Whitmore was among them for a significant portion of the evening. The name settled into Sebastian with an uncomfortable certainty, pieces of the past few weeks suddenly aligning into a pattern he had been too distracted to notice before. Cordelia's pointed comments about Alina, her careful concern that had always felt slightly too calculated, her visible discomfort whenever Alina's name arose in conversation. He arranged a meeting with Cordelia that same afternoon, arriving at her townhouse with a controlled but unmistakable tension in his posture. "Sebastian, what a pleasant surprise," Cordelia said, greeting him with practiced warmth that did nothing to ease the tightness in his chest. "I need to ask you something directly," he said, foregoing pleasantries entirely. "Did you start the rumor regarding Miss Voss and myself?" Cordelia's smile faltered slightly, though she recovered quickly. "I'm not certain what you mean." "I mean," Sebastian said, his voice low and controlled, "that someone suggested to a group of guests at my own benefit that Alina Voss has been manipulating her position within my household for personal gain. I have reason to believe that person was standing near the refreshment table for a significant portion of the evening, in your company." Cordelia's expression shifted, the careful mask slipping just enough to reveal something sharper underneath. "I merely made an observation, Sebastian. Surely you can't blame me for what others chose to make of it." "So you admit it," Sebastian said, something cold settling into his voice. "I admit nothing beyond concern for your reputation," Cordelia said, though her tone had grown defensive. "You cannot possibly believe that woman's intentions are entirely innocent. She arrived from nowhere, wormed her way into your household, and within weeks had you defending her honor to your own staff. Forgive me for questioning whether that pattern seemed entirely coincidental." "Her intentions," Sebastian said, his voice rising slightly, "have been more genuine than anyone in this city has shown me in years, including you. She has never once asked me for anything beyond fair payment for honest work. She has never flattered me, never sought favor, never once used my title to her advantage. If anything, she has spent the past several weeks reminding me that my title means nothing if I cannot treat people with basic decency." Cordelia's composure finally cracked entirely, years of careful strategy unraveling in the face of his unexpected defense. "And what am I supposed to have gained from years of loyalty, Sebastian? I have attended every event, supported every family obligation, positioned myself exactly where you needed me, all while she simply appeared and disrupted everything within weeks." "Loyalty built on expectation of reward is not loyalty at all, Cordelia," Sebastian said quietly. "It is simply patience disguised as devotion." He left her townhouse without another word, the confirmation of her betrayal settling heavily into his chest, though beneath the anger, a sharper urgency had already begun to take hold. He needed to find Alina, to explain, to undo whatever damage his own doubt had caused before it became irreversible. He arrived at Alina's small apartment building just as the afternoon light had begun fading into evening, his heart pounding with an urgency he had not felt in years. He knocked on her door, uncertain of what he would say, only certain that he needed to say something before it was too late. Alina opened the door, her expression guarded the moment she saw him standing there. "Sebastian, what are you doing here?" "I found the source of the rumor," he said immediately, breathless from the walk up 3 flights of stairs. "It was Cordelia, she admitted it herself." Alina's expression remained carefully neutral, though something flickered behind her eyes. "I see." "Alina, I am so sorry," Sebastian continued, the words tumbling out with more emotion than he usually allowed himself to show. "I should have trusted you immediately. I should have known better than to let old fears cloud my judgment about someone who has shown me nothing but honesty since the moment we met." Alina crossed her arms, her expression still guarded despite the sincerity in his voice. "Sebastian, this isn't just about the rumor. This is about the fact that the moment things became difficult, you doubted me instead of standing beside me. That tells me something important about how quickly trust can dissolve, even when it feels solid." Sebastian stepped closer, his voice softening. You're right. I have spent my entire life learning to expect betrayal from everyone around me, and that fear made me doubt the one person who has never given me a reason to. That isn't fair to you, and I understand if my apology feels insufficient given the hurt I caused. Elena studied him for a long moment, her arms slowly relaxing at her sides. I saw boxes in your hallway, Sebastian said suddenly, noticing for the first time the packed belongings visible behind her in the small apartment. I accepted another contract, Elena said quietly, in a different city. I was going to finish the paperwork remotely and leave by the end of the week. Panic flared sharply in Sebastian's chest at the thought of her leaving entirely, disappearing from his life as suddenly as she had entered it. Please don't leave because of this, he said, his voice raw with an honesty he rarely allowed himself. Not because of my mistake. It's not just about your mistake, Sebastian, Elena said, though her voice had softened considerably. It's about protecting myself. I have spent my entire career building a reputation through hard work, and I cannot afford to be caught in the middle of gossip and social politics that ultimately have nothing to do with me. Then let me fix this, Sebastian said. Let me make sure everyone understands the truth, that the rumor was baseless, that you have done nothing but bring integrity and genuine care into everything you've touched at Ashworth Hall. Elena hesitated, clearly weighing his words carefully. Even if you fix the rumor, Sebastian, that doesn't erase what happened between us. You doubted me the moment it became difficult not to. I know, Sebastian said quietly, and I cannot undo that moment, but I can promise you that it will not happen again. I can promise that I am capable of learning, of unlearning fears that have shaped me since childhood, if you are willing to give me the chance to prove it. The apartment fell silent, the weight of his words settling between them. Elena's expression remained thoughtful, though the hard edge of her earlier anger had softened into something more contemplative. I need time to think, she said finally. This isn't something I can decide standing in a doorway. Take whatever time you need, Sebastian said, though the words cost him more than he expected. I will be waiting whatever you decide. He left her apartment that evening with far more uncertainty than he had arrived with, though beneath the uncertainty, a quiet resolve had settled into him, a determination to prove, through actions rather than words, that he was capable of becoming someone worthy of the trust she had once so freely given him. Over the following days, Sebastian worked tirelessly to correct the damage caused by Cordelia's rumor, personally addressing the gossip among key social circles, ensuring that anyone who had heard the false accusations also heard the truth directly from him. He spoke with genuine conviction about Elena's integrity, her skill, her unwavering honesty, refusing to allow the false narrative to stand uncorrected. Word of his efforts reached Elena through mutual acquaintances, small reports of his public defense of her character reaching her even as she continued preparing for her departure. Each report chipped away slightly at the wall she had built around herself since their difficult conversation, though she remained cautious, unwilling to trust so easily after being doubted so completely. Margaret, sensing the delicate balance of the situation, invited Elena for tea one afternoon, extending an olive branch that Elena, out of respect for the older woman's genuine warmth throughout their acquaintance, chose to accept. He has not stopped speaking of you since your conversation, Margaret said gently, pouring tea for them both in the quiet sitting room. Not with regret alone, but with genuine admiration for who you are. Admiration doesn't undo doubt, Elena said carefully, though her voice lacked its earlier sharpness. No, Margaret agreed. But growth often begins exactly where doubt once lived. Sebastian has spent his entire life believing that vulnerability invites betrayal. You are the first person who has shown him otherwise, and I believe, deep down, he knows exactly how rare that is. Elena considered the words carefully, the tea growing cool in her hands as she weighed everything that had happened over the past several weeks, everything she had felt, everything she still feared losing if she allowed herself to trust again too quickly. I don't know if I'm ready to decide anything yet, she admitted quietly. No one is asking you to decide today, Margaret said kindly. only to remain open to the possibility that people, even those raised by difficult lessons, are capable of becoming better than the fears that shaped them. Alina left the tea that afternoon with far more to consider than she had anticipated, the quiet certainty of her departure suddenly feeling less absolute than it had only days before. Meanwhile, Sebastian continued his efforts, though beneath the public corrections and social defenses, a quieter, more personal transformation had begun taking shape within him. He found himself reflecting more deeply on the lessons his father had instilled, questioning for the first time in his life whether those lessons had ever truly served him, or whether they had simply kept him isolated, cautious, and alone. By the end of the week, as Alina's scheduled departure drew closer, Sebastian knew that whatever chance remained to convince her to stay would need to come not through grand gestures or public corrections, but through something far more honest, far more vulnerable than anything he had ever allowed himself to express before. He began preparing, quietly and carefully, for what he intended to be his final attempt to undo the damage his doubt had caused, unaware that time was growing shorter than he realized, and that Alina's departure had been moved forward by 2 full days. News of Alina's earlier departure reached Sebastian through Margaret, who had learned of the change during a brief phone call with Alina that afternoon. He received the information with a jolt of panic that surprised him with its intensity. The careful plans he had been preparing suddenly compressed into a single evening, rather than the days he had assumed he still had. "She leaves tonight," Margaret said, watching her grandson carefully. "Her train departs at midnight." Sebastian felt the weight of the words settle heavily in his chest. Midnight. Only a few hours remained to say everything he had spent the past several days trying to organize into something coherent, something worthy of the woman who had changed him so completely in such a short time. "I need to see her," he said, already moving toward the door. "Sebastian," Margaret called after him, stopping him briefly. "Whatever you say tonight, say it honestly. Alina has never responded to performance or grand gestures. She responds to truth." He nodded, the advice settling into him as he hurried toward his car, his mind racing through everything he wanted to say, everything he needed her to understand before she disappeared from his life entirely. The drive to the train station felt longer than he remembered it being, every red light, every slow-moving vehicle ahead of him feeling like a deliberate obstacle placed between him and the only chance he had left to make things right. By the time he arrived, the station was quiet, only a handful of travelers scattered across the platform, their footsteps echoing softly against the tiled floors. He found Alina near the far end of the platform, a single suitcase beside her, her expression distant as she stared down the empty tracks, waiting for a train that would carry her away from everything that had happened over the past several weeks. "Alina," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet station. She turned, visibly startled to see him standing there. "Sebastian, what are you doing here?" "I couldn't let you leave without saying everything I should have said days ago," he said, closing the distance between them with steady, determined steps. "Sebastian, we already talked about this," Alina said, though her voice lacked the firm resolve it had carried during their previous conversation. "I know," he said, "but I don't think I said it clearly enough. I don't think you understand exactly how much you have changed me, Alina, in such a short amount of time." She remained silent, watching him carefully, though something in her expression had softened slightly, allowing him space to continue. "My entire life, I was taught that vulnerability was weakness," Sebastian said, the words coming easier now than he expected, unguarded in a way he had never allowed himself to be in public. "I was taught that trust was dangerous, that people only wanted proximity to my title, never genuine connection to me as a person. I built walls so high that even my own grandmother struggled to reach me most days." He paused, searching her eyes for any sign of what she was feeling, before continuing. "Then you walked into my ballroom and refused to bow, and something in me recognized immediately that you were different. Not because you challenged my authority, but because you saw me, truly saw me, as a person rather than a title, from the very first moment we met." Alina's eyes glistened slightly, though she remained quiet, listening intently to every word. I doubted you when the rumor surfaced, and I will carry the regret of that moment for a long time, Sebastian continued. But that doubt came from fear, not from any genuine belief that you were capable of the things Cordelia suggested. Deep down, I knew the truth immediately. I simply let old lessons override what I already understood in my heart. And what do you understand now? Elena asked softly, her voice barely audible above the quiet hum of the station. That you are the only person who has ever made me feel like more than my title, Sebastian said, his voice thick with emotion. That the moment you refused to bow was the exact moment I realized I did not want you to bow to me at all. I wanted to stand beside you as an equal, as someone who sees me clearly and chooses to remain anyway. The distant sound of an approaching train echoed faintly down the tracks, growing steadily louder, though neither of them acknowledged it, too absorbed in the weight of the moment between them. I am asking you to stay, Sebastian said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability evident in every word. Not as an event planner, not as an employee of Ashworth Hall, but as someone I cannot imagine my life continuing without. I understand if the request comes too late, if the damage from my doubt has already closed whatever chance we might have had. But I could not let you leave without you knowing exactly how much you have meant to me. Elena stood silently for a long moment, the approaching train growing louder, its lights now visible in the distance, casting long shadows across the platform. Sebastian, she said finally, her voice trembling slightly, you hurt me deeply when you doubted me. That kind of hurt doesn't disappear simply because of a beautiful speech on a train platform. Sebastian's chest tightened, fear gripping him at the possibility that his words had come too late, that the damage truly was irreversible. But, Elena continued, her expression softening further, I have spent the past several days thinking about everything that happened between us, not just the doubt, but everything before it. The conversations in the library, the laughter in the garden, the way you fought for me the moment you learned the truth. People capable of genuine growth are rare, Sebastian, and I believe, despite everything, that you are one of them. Hope flickered cautiously in his chest as he watched her expression, searching for confirmation of what her words seemed to suggest. The train pulled into the station with a loud, echoing hiss, its doors opening to allow the small group of waiting travelers to board. Elena glanced toward it, then back at Sebastian, her hand tightening slightly around the handle of her suitcase. What are you deciding? Sebastian asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the uncertainty of the moment stretching between them like a held breath. Elena looked at the train, then at Sebastian, her expression shifting slowly from uncertainty into something clearer, something more resolved. The final boarding call echoed across the platform, the doors beginning their slow countdown toward closing, and Sebastian felt his heart pounding as he waited, breathless, for whatever answer Elena was about to give him. Elena set her suitcase down. The sound of it touching the platform seemed impossibly loud against the backdrop of the departing train, its doors closing seconds later, its wheels beginning to turn as it pulled away from the station without her. Sebastian watched, hardly daring to breathe, as she turned fully to face him, her expression calm now, steady in a way that told him her decision had not been made lightly. I'm not staying because of a speech, Sebastian, she said quietly. I'm staying because I believe you meant every word of it. Relief flooded through him with such force that he nearly reached for her immediately, though he held back, giving her space to finish what she clearly needed to say. But I need you to understand something, Elena continued, her voice firm despite its softness. I will not stay if this means quietly fitting into the version of a partner your world expects, someone who bows, who defers, who exists to make your position easier without ever being seen as equal to it. I refuse to bow the night we met because I have spent my entire life proving my worth to people who assumed it should be given freely simply because of who they were born as. I will not spend the rest of my life doing the same thing in a relationship. I would never ask that of you, Sebastian said immediately, the sincerity in his voice unmistakable. If anything, these past several weeks have taught me that I do not want someone who bows to me, Alina. I want someone who challenges me, who sees through the title to the person underneath, who stays not because of obligation, but because they choose to, again and again, exactly as you are choosing right now. Alina studied him carefully, searching his expression for any hint of insincerity, finding none. "This will not be easy," she said. "Your world is filled with people like Cordelia, people who will resent someone like me for occupying a space they believe belongs to them by birth." "Then we will face that together," Sebastian said. "I am done allowing fear of other people's opinions to dictate my choices. I spent my entire life doing that, and it left me isolated and alone until the moment you refused to bow and reminded me that there was another way to live." A small, genuine smile finally broke across Alina's face, chasing away the last remnants of doubt and hesitation that had lingered since their earlier conversation. "You really are quite dramatic for a duke," she said, though her voice was warm with affection rather than criticism. "Only for the people who matter most," Sebastian replied, stepping closer, the distance between them finally closing entirely. He reached for her hand, and she allowed it, her fingers intertwining with his as though they had always belonged there, as though the past several weeks of tension and doubt had simply been necessary steps toward this exact moment of understanding between them. "I meant everything I said," Sebastian continued softly. "You have changed me, Alina, more deeply than I ever thought possible. I do not simply want you to stay in my life as someone I care for from a distance. I want to build something real with you. Something built on honesty and equality, not on the old lessons of control and fear that shaped everything before you." "Then let's build it," Alina said simply, her voice steady with quiet conviction, "together, as equals exactly as you promised." They stood together on the quiet platform, the last echoes of the departed train fading into the distance, the station settling into a peaceful stillness around them. For the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the future ahead felt not like a series of obligations and expectations, but like a genuine choice, freely made, freely embraced. News of Sebastian's public correction of the rumor, combined with his heartfelt gesture at the train station, which had been witnessed by a few curious onlookers and quickly shared among social circles, spread quickly through the same drawing rooms that had once whispered false accusations against Alina. The narrative shifted rapidly, admiration replacing suspicion, as people began recognizing the depth of genuine connection between the Duke and the woman who had refused to bow to him. Cordelia, upon hearing the news, understood immediately that her carefully constructed plans had not only failed but had backfired entirely, cementing a bond she had hoped to destroy. She quietly withdrew from Sebastian's social circle in the weeks that followed, her attempts at damage control falling flat against the genuine happiness now radiating from Ashworth Hall. Margaret, watching the transformation in her grandson with quiet satisfaction, found herself reflecting often on how much the estate had changed since Alina's arrival. The halls, once heavy with formality and unspoken tension, had grown warmer, filled more frequently with laughter, with genuine conversation, with the kind of ease that had been missing since long before Sebastian's father had passed. Weeks later, at another gathering held within the same ballroom where Alina had first refused to bow, the atmosphere felt entirely different from that fateful evening months earlier. Sebastian stood at the top of the staircase once more, though this time, as he descended, his eyes immediately sought out Alina among the crowd, finding her near the same table of white roses where their story had first begun. As he reached her, instead of demanding anything, instead of expecting deference or formality, he simply extended his hand, bowing his head slightly toward her in a small, private gesture that only she fully understood the significance of. "Every time," he said quietly, "I find myself wanting to bow to you instead." Alina smiled, taking his offered hand. "Careful, Your Grace, people might start to think you've gone soft." "Only for you," he replied, and the warmth in his voice left no doubt that he meant every word. They danced together as the orchestra began playing, the guests around them watching with quiet admiration, no longer whispering rumors or doubts, but genuine recognition of two people who had found, against significant odds, a partnership built on equality, honesty, and the kind of respect that could never be demanded, only earned. Outside, the night sky stretched clear and endless above Ashworth Hall, the estate glowing warmly beneath it. No longer a house built on fear and control, but slowly, steadily, becoming a home built on something far more lasting. Spring arrived at Ashworth Hall with a gentleness the estate had not known in years, the gardens blooming in full color, the halls filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the changing season, and everything to do with the two people who now shared the responsibility of running the household together. Sebastian had spent the winter months slowly unlearning the rigid habits his father had instilled in him, and Alina had spent those same months teaching him, patiently and without judgment, that leadership built on partnership could be far stronger than leadership built on fear. Their relationship had not been without challenges. Adjusting to a world that had never before required him to consider another person's perspective as equal to his own tested Sebastian, in ways he had not anticipated. There were disagreements over estate decisions, moments where old instincts toward control resurfaced, quickly checked by Alina's steady insistence that decisions affecting them both required conversation rather than command. Each disagreement, though occasionally sharp, ended not in resentment, but in a deeper understanding between them, a recognition that genuine partnership required effort, communication, and a willingness to grow uncomfortable together, rather than retreat into old, familiar patterns of isolation. Alina, for her part, had to adjust to a world entirely foreign to her own upbringing, learning to navigate social expectations she had never before needed to consider, facing occasional coldness from those within Sebastian's circle who still viewed her arrival with quiet suspicion. Yet she faced each challenge with the same steady confidence that had first caught Sebastian's attention in the ballroom, refusing to shrink herself to fit expectations that had never been designed with someone like her in mind. Margaret watched the evolution of their relationship with quiet pride, often remarking to close friends that the estate had not felt this alive since long before her son's passing, since long before rigid control had replaced warmth within its walls. She had taken to spending her afternoons with Alina, sharing stories of the family's history, offering guidance not as a matriarch enforcing tradition, but as a grandmother genuinely invested in her grandson's happiness. One afternoon, several months after the train station, Sebastian found Alina in the garden where they had first spoken his name without his title attached, kneeling beside a newly planted section of flowers she had insisted on adding to the estate's grounds. "You've been busy," he observed, watching her work with the same quiet admiration he had felt since their earliest encounters. "I thought the gardens needed something new," Alina said, not looking up from her work. "Something that wasn't inherited from your father's rigid planning." Sebastian smiled, kneeling beside her to help. "What did you choose?" "Wild flowers," she said simply. "Things that grow according to their own nature rather than forced into perfect rows." He understood immediately the deeper meaning behind her choice, the quiet metaphor woven into something as simple as garden planning. "Fitting," he said softly. They worked together in comfortable silence for a while, the afternoon sun warming the soil beneath their hands, the estate around them settling into the kind of peaceful rhythm neither of them had known before finding each other. "Do you ever regret staying that night?" Sebastian asked eventually, the question surfacing from a place of genuine curiosity rather than lingering insecurity. Alina paused, considering the question seriously before answering. "Never," she said. "Though I won't pretend the adjustment has been simple, there are still moments when I feel like an outsider in your world, moments when old doubts creep back in." "And when they do?" Sebastian asked. "I remind myself of the platform," Alina said, smiling softly. "Of the way you looked at me, completely unguarded, willing to lose everything familiar rather than lose the chance at something real. That memory tends to quiet most doubts rather quickly." Sebastian reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers among the soil and newly planted flowers. I intend to keep giving you reasons to remember that moment, for as long as you'll allow me to. Careful, Alina said, laughing softly. That sounds dangerously close to a promise. It is exactly a promise, Sebastian said, his voice steady and certain in a way that left no room for doubt. As the months continued to pass, their partnership grew steadily stronger, weathering the inevitable challenges that came with blending two entirely different worlds into something new. Sebastian began implementing changes throughout the estate, changes inspired directly by Alina's influence, treating staff with newfound respect, listening to concerns he had once dismissed without consideration, slowly transforming Ashworth Hall from a house built on hierarchy into something closer to a genuine community. The charity work that had first brought Alina into his life became a cornerstone of their shared purpose, the two of them expanding the initial hospital fundraising efforts into a broader foundation dedicated to supporting underprivileged communities throughout the region. Alina's practical understanding of hardship, combined with Sebastian's resources and growing willingness to use his position for genuine good rather than personal validation, created an impact neither of them could have achieved alone. Lady Cordelia, having quietly withdrawn from their social circle in the aftermath of her failed scheme, eventually moved away entirely, her attempts at reputation repair finding little success among a community that had witnessed firsthand the genuine transformation occurring at Ashworth Hall. Few mourned her absence, and fewer still remembered her role in the story beyond a footnote in the early chapters of Sebastian and Alina's unlikely beginning. A year after the night Alina had first refused to bow, Ashworth Hall hosted another grand gathering, this one held not for charity, but to celebrate an announcement that had been quietly anticipated by everyone close to the couple. Sebastian stood once more at the top of the staircase, though this time, Alina stood beside him rather than waiting below, an equal presence rather than a hired guest navigating unfamiliar territory. As the guests gathered below, watching the two of them descend together, hand in hand, Sebastian felt none of the old need for control, none of the old fear of vulnerability that had once defined every interaction within these walls. Instead, he felt only certainty, steady and unwavering, standing beside the woman who had taught him that true strength required neither fear nor dominance, only honesty and the courage to remain open despite every lesson suggesting otherwise. "Ready?" Alina asked quietly as they reached the final step. "With you," Sebastian said, "always." The crowd below applauded warmly as Margaret stepped forward to announce their engagement, her voice thick with genuine joy as she welcomed Alina formally into the family, not as an outsider granted permission to belong, but as someone who had already proven, through months of steady partnership, that she belonged exactly as she was. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around them, Sebastian and Alina stepped briefly onto the same garden path where he had first heard his own name spoken without his title, the night air cool and familiar around them. "We've come a long way from that ballroom," Alina said softly, looking up at the stars scattered across the clear night sky. "We have," Sebastian agreed, pulling her closer, "though I find myself grateful every single day for the moment you refused to bow." "I told you," Alina said, smiling against his shoulder. "Respect isn't something that should ever be demanded." "No," Sebastian said quietly, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "It should only ever be earned, freely given, exactly as you have given yours to me." They stood together beneath the quiet stars, the estate glowing warmly behind them, no longer a symbol of inherited fear and rigid control, but a home built entirely on the foundation of two people who had chosen each other, again and again, not out of obligation, but out of genuine, unwavering choice. And as the celebration continued inside, filled with laughter and warmth that had once seemed impossible within those walls, both of them understood clearly that their story, unlike so many built on power and expectation, had only ever truly begun the moment someone dared to stand tall instead of bowing down.